Hello. We are going to pick back up into part 2 of Echo by Pam Munoz Ryan. Before we begin, let's make sure to take our deep breath in and exhale. And we'll begin. Chapter 12. On the way back to the trolley stop, Frankie skipped ahead of Mike and Mr. Howard and stopped in front of a shop window. He turned, wide-eyed, waving for them to hurry. Mike jogged to join him. "What is it, kid?" "It's them," he said, pointing to a large poster displayed in the window of Wilkinson's Music Emporium. "It's the harmonica wizards!" Frankie pressed his nose on the glass. Mike looked up at the poster of over 60 boys in military-style uniforms, capes, and plumed hats. A tiny man wearing a red apron stepped from the shop. His gray mustache had been waxed into an old-fashioned handlebar, curling up on both ends. "Good day, gentlemen." He nodded toward the poster. "Aren't they something? The famous Philadelphia Harmonica Band. Are you boys going to enter the contest? Still plenty of time." "Sir, what's all this?" asked Mr. Howard. "Citywide competition in August. Thousands of children taking lessons all over Philadelphia. Lots of prizes, including musical instruments. It's an audition of sorts. Top 5 winners are invited to join the band and travel all over the world. They have their own women's auxiliary, raising money for uniforms, finding homes for boys to board in, even sending them to college." Frankie nodded as if he were an expert. "We were going to try out so we could get out of the orphanage, but now we don't have to, 'cause now we adopted." "What? Well, that's wonderful. Doesn't mean you still can't enter for the fun of it," said Mr. Wilkinson. "But you gotta have the official harmonica, and you gotta be 10 years old, 'cept if you're the mascot. See?" Frankie pointed to the young boy in the poster. "That's right. The youngster's a novelty and only plays with the band when it's in town. Doesn't travel with them. Band's got all sorts of rules about such things. But here's a crowd pleaser in that uniform." He winked at Frankie. "And you're right about the harmonica. Has to be the Hona Marine Band in the key of C. I just received a shipment from the warehouse yesterday, and they're going like hotcakes. Only 65 cents each." He pulled a striped handkerchief from his apron pocket and began blotting his forehead. "Speaking of hotcakes, this weather's steamy kitchen. The heat has about got me beat." Frankie looked at Mr. Howard. "Mrs. Pennyweather took away the harmonicas Granny bought for us." Mr. Howard smiled. "Mr. Wilkinson, I don't think we're interested in the contest, but 2 harmonicas might be just the ticket." "Right this way," said Mr. Wilkinson. He opened the shop door, and a bell on the frame jingled. Mr. Howard and Frankie followed Mr. Wilkinson to the counter near the register. "There are kittens underfoot, so watch your step," said Mr. Wilkinson. 3 of 'em somewhere in this store." Mike walked down the center aisle, mindful of where he stepped, savoring the smell of bow rosin, leather cases, and wood polish. His eyes couldn't look fast enough at all the instruments that crowded every available space. Trumpets in glass case, cellos propped at attention, violins suspended from the ceiling, crash cymbals and snare drums, a bass drum on a pedestal. It reminded him of the shop where Granny used to take him to buy sheet music. "Isn't it wonderful?" she'd say. "Music is just waiting to escape from all these instruments? He smiled, remembering how he'd always expected to see a string of black notes fleeing from the bell of a tuba or a trombone. Frankie ran toward him, holding a calico kitten in one hand and a new harmonica in the other. "Look, Mike! It comes with an instruction booklet with songs. Listen!" He ran his harmonica over his mouth. "Doesn't it sound grand? I took the last one by the register, but Mr. Wilkinson said for you to go to the back counter and get one from the carton he just opened." Frankie wandered back to where Mr. Howard and Mr. Wilkinson stood together talking. Mike worked his way to the back of the store until he reached a counter in front of a curtained storeroom. On top sat a big open carton filled with slim cases. Mike lifted one and opened it. Inside, 12 individual boxes lay in a row, each imprinted with a photo of the United States Marine Band. The last box on the bottom caught his eye. The blue border seemed brighter than the rest, the red lettering bolder, the photograph of the Marine Band sharper. When he lifted the box, he could have sworn he heard a chord erupt like a high-pitched chime. He glanced around. It must have been Mr. Wilkinson's cash register. Mike opened the box, picked up the harmonica, and turned it over. He noticed a small, red, hand-painted M on one edge. He lifted the harmonica to his lips, ran the scale, and then played the last 6 notes of America the Beautiful. During the pause after the final note and before his next breath, all the instruments in the shop struck a long, echoing chord. He spun around, his eyes darting to the motionless instruments. No one else was around. Everything was quiet. It was stuffy in the shop, and he felt lightheaded. He swiped at his brow, now beaded with perspiration, and put the harmonica back in its box. He clutched it in his hands as he headed toward the front. He was escorted by a chorus of sounds, the hoots of clarinets, the swish-swish of the snare drum, the plucking of violin strings, and the deep strum of the cello. When he passed the instruments, a fanfare blasted. He glanced over his shoulder. Everything looked the same. Had Granny been right? Was the music escaping? Was all of this some clever trick of Mr. Wilkinson's? A kitten followed him, pawing at his ankles. With each step, the space around him felt more crowded, and the air thicker. "I've already paid," said Mr. Howard when Mike reached him. "I see you chose a harmonica." Mike nodded. Mr. Wilkinson winked at him. "I always say the instrument chooses the musician instead of the other way around." He nodded toward Mr. Howard. "Thank you for your business." As they walked out and the door swung shut behind them, the bell on the frame fluttered like a giddy piccolo. Outside, Mike rubbed his forehead. Maybe the heat had him beat too. Even the harmonica felt warm in his hand. He leaned toward Frankie. "You hear anything funny in there?" "No, but guess what? Mr. Howard said Mr. Potter is the best harmonica player he's ever heard in his entire life, and tomorrow's his day off, and maybe he can teach us some songs." All the way to the trolley stop, Mike and Frankie played the harmonicas. Mike's sounded different from Frankie's. His had a tone he couldn't explain. It seemed older and rounder somehow. As he played songs he already knew by heart, his steps became more buoyant, and his heart filled with something he had not felt in a long time. What was that? Was it happiness? The trolley stopped. Bell clanging. Mr. Howard smiled. "Come on, boys, time to head home." Frankie grabbed Mike's hand and squeezed it. Mike looked at the kid's smiling face and squeezed it in return. Mr. Howard had said home. Maybe this time they could catch a break and everything would go right. Chapter 13. Mr. Potter could make the harmonica sound like a train on a track. A baby crying, or rain falling in the wind. Sunday afternoon, Mike and Frankie sat on the bench under a shade tree next to the Potter's cottage, hypnotized by his playing. Mike couldn't take his eyes from Mr. Potter's hands or his mouth. The way his head swayed with the music, he recognized familiar melodies, but they were peppered with repeating rhythms. The sound seemed to transport him to another place and time, something ancient and earthy. The beat started and stopped, questioned and answered. Mike had never heard anything like it before. When Mr. Potter paused, Mike asked, "What is that sound?" Mr. Potter nodded and grinned. "Kinda catches you, doesn't it? Called the blues." "Why?" asked Frankie. "Ever heard someone say they're feeling blue?" asked Mr. Potter. "Means sad, or they got the melancholies about life. So blues music is about all the trials and tribulations people got in their hearts from living. It's about what folks want but don't have. Blues is a song begging for its life." "But that doesn't sound sad all the time," said Mike. "No, the songs are full of something else too," said Mr. Potter. "That's the thing. No matter how much you don't have, there's always so much more of life to be had. So, no matter how much sadness is in a song, there's equal amount of maybe things will get better someday soon." "Can you make any song the blues?" said Mike. "Not always, but you can make most sound bluesy." Frankie laughed. "Bluesy? That's funny. Means you can give most any song the flavor of the blues." Mr. Potter put his harmonica to his lips and played "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." It was the same melody their mom used to sing, but with repeating phrases. At the end, Mr. Potter seemed to goad the song into wailing. "How did you do that?" asked Mike. "Easy," Mr. Potter grinned. "You take the tune and break it up. Then do over some of the lines, then sprinkle in some grit from your insides. You play the song like you're testifying to the feelings you hold in your heart, happy, sad, angry. Mike, you follow what I do?" He played 2 chords. Mike repeated them. He played a note, bending it. Mike copied him. Mr. Potter made each phrase different from the last. Back and forth they went. First Mr. Potter, then Mike. Short notes, like words, followed by longer phrases, like full sentences, then entire paragraphs of music, as if the two of them were having a conversation. When they were done, Frankie clapped. "Now me," he said. Mr. Potter started over, making the phrases simpler. After Frankie caught on, Mike joined in. In the shade of the tree, with the sounds of the 3 harmonicas talking to each other, and all that had happened to them in the last few days, Mike dared to let another sliver of happiness creep into his heart. Mrs. Potter called to Frankie and Mike from the back door of the main house and waved them over. Frankie ran ahead. Mr. Potter pointed to Mike's harmonica. "That is something special. Got a quality I never heard before." Mike nodded. I feel different when I play it." Mr. Potter smiled. "Sometimes an instrument does that to a person. Makes the world seem brighter, with more possibilities." Mike understood what he meant. He'd felt it. He held out the harmonica, pointing to the tiny scroll-like M on the pear wood edge that he'd noticed yesterday. "What's that mean, Mr. Potter?" "I don't know. Never saw such a thing. Frankie's have it." Mike shook his head. "No, I checked. Probably put there by its maker. The harmonica isn't the only thing special. You gotta have a natural talent. Mrs. Potter told me about your piano playing. Now, I know what she was going on about. Wait here." Mr. Potter went into the cottage. A few minutes later he came back and handed Mike a thick book with music, with harmonica tabs. "You can borrow this a while. It'll pique your interest just fine. You gonna come back tomorrow and jam with me some more?" Mike nodded. "Thank you, yes, sir." Slowly, Mike made his way toward the house, playing the songs he'd just learned, when a movement caught his eye. He glanced up at the second-story window. Mrs. Sturbridge stood watching him, but before he could raise his hand to wave, she disappeared, and the draperies plunged closed. He hadn't had an opportunity to apologize for the piano playing yesterday. Was she still upset about that? Or was it something else? Mrs. Sturbridge's strange behavior continued. For 2 weeks they hardly saw her. Mrs. Potter kept them busy with a schedule of meals and playtime and chores. Mr. Potter let Frankie follow him around like a puppy. Mr. Howard came every few evenings and ate dinner with them, staying after to play catch on the lawn or a game of checkers on the porch. He took them to the park on the weekends. She never joined them. Mike tried to tell himself it didn't matter, that just being together was enough for him and Frankie. But he saw how the kids' eyes followed Mrs. Sturbridge when she whisked past them. He felt Frankie's longing to be part of a family again, and sometimes, in his heart of hearts, Mike even dared to wish the same thing for himself. He took comfort in the blues. He practiced as much as he could with Mr. Potter, working through the music book and making each song bluesy. Every time he played, he felt buoyed, lifted up, and full of possibilities, as if he were riding on the shoulders of some unknown power. He could sense something optimistic in his heart, making his music shine from the inside out. In the hours between playing, though, he felt confused and unsettled. Something about being on Amaryllis Drive was rotten. The night before the 4th of July, Mike sat on the side of his bed, flipping through the pages of the book Mr. Potter had given him and studying the music. He started at the beginning with "Good Night, Ladies," followed by "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow" and "Oh, Susanna." Frankie came into the bedroom and climbed up next to him. "Play me a song, please." Mike obliged, easing into "My Old Kentucky Home." "That was good," said Frankie, his eyes already drooping. "Mike, do you think tomorrow—" His eyes closed and his forehead wrinkled, as if he were wishing hard for something. Mike didn't need Frankie to finish the question. Every night he asked the same ones. "Do you think tomorrow she will spend time with us? Or maybe let us eat in the dining room with her instead of in the kitchen?" Mike reached over and smoothed Frankie's forehead. Do you think she'll take us to see fireworks at the park 'cause of 4th of July?" Frankie murmured. "Especially since Mr. Howard is out of town." "Sure, kid," whispered Mike. "Go to sleep now. Maybe tomorrow will be the day." Chapter 14. The 4th of July came and went without mention. The Saturday following, after breakfast, Mike sat in the bedroom, playing the harmonica, while he and Frankie waited for Mr. Howard to take them to the park. Frankie got up from the floor where he'd been pencil drawing and went to the mirror above the dresser. "Mike, do you think I need another haircut?" Mike stopped playing and studied Frankie. "Maybe in a few weeks, but you look fine for now." "Do you think I'm too noisy?" "Frankie, no, why?" "'Cause everybody here likes us, except her. I've been leaving nosegays from the garden by her bedroom door, and making pictures, and leaving them at her place at the dining table, but she doesn't ever talk to us. So I was just thinking, if Mr. Howard took me for a haircut, or if I required her, then maybe," he shrugged. Listen, like I tell you every day, she's just getting used to us. She wasn't expecting boys. Or two of anything. And it takes some folks longer than others to warm up. At least we're not at Bishop's. And we're together, right? Frankie nodded. Right. You know, sometimes I feel guilty. We have so many nice things now when so many other kids don't have anything, said Mike. You ever feel that way? Frankie nodded. I think about James and how he's still at Bishop's with his shoes too small, and I have new ones. Same here. I think about Mouse living on the streets and wonder what he's going to do when it gets cold. And here I have a bed full of blankets. I think about these things a lot. About how come it was us and not someone else got picked to come here. We're the lucky ones, kid. Frankie gave him a wobbly smile. Mike wished he believed his own words, but even though they had so much, too many things still didn't add up. Even though Mrs. Potter had said Mike would get used to things not making sense, after 3 weeks he hadn't. And that worried him. There was something big gnawing at him, a question far more confounding than a piano in a music room that sorely needed playing. Mrs. Potter appeared in the doorway. Mr. Howard is here. Frankie, let's get y'all cleaned up a bit. Is she coming with us? Asked Frankie. Mike looked at Mrs. Potter and caught the look of pity in her eyes and the almost imperceptible shake of her head. She put on a smile. Not today, honey. But lots of vendors are still in the park. Being it's just after the holiday, you'll enjoy it. She took Frankie's hand and led him out of the room. Mike heard voices from the open window. He stepped closer. Down below, Mrs. Sturbridge and Mr. Howard stood on the front walk. She was dressed for town in her usual black, carrying gloves and a handbag. Mr. Howard had his hands on his hips. You're going to see Golding today? Why don't you come with us? I'm trying to undo what's been done. They're good boys, Eunie, and talented. You'd see if you gave them a chance. Whatever Mrs. Sturbridge said next was so quiet that Mike couldn't hear, but her gaze dropped to the ground. Mr. Howard shook his head. I know you've suffered, Eunie, but so have those boys. I'm sorry I put you in a situation that was far different from what you were expecting. I was doing my best, given that time was running out. You know, all your father ever wanted was for this house to be filled with children and music, and for you to open your heart again. She looked up at Mr. Howard. What good has opening my heart ever done? Everyone who mattered leaves me. That's not true. I never left you. Not on the playground when you were a girl and lost your mother. Not when you married a man your father didn't approve of. I stayed at your side when little Henry and your father. He choked up and his voice cracked. I never left through all of it, and I'm still here. But if this is your way of telling me that I don't matter to you, then maybe it's time I move on. He turned and walked into the house. Her eyes followed him. She looked up and caught Mike, watching her from the window. He felt the blood rush to his face. Would she be angry if he was eavesdropping? She didn't look mad. She looked as if she might cry. Before he could blink, she spun around and strode to the Packard, where Mr. Potter held the door open. Mike watched the car pull away, more questions taunting him. What did her dead father have to do with their adoption? Who was Henry? And what was she trying to undo? Chapter 15. As they walked toward the park, Mr. Howard didn't talk or whistle, and the spring in his step was gone. When they passed his house, Frankie asked, Have you ever climbed those trees? Mr. Howard shook his head. Not since I was a boy, but you boys can climb them any time you like. Mike won't ever, 'cause he's afraid of heights. Is that true, Mike? Mike nodded. I'm afraid of spiders, said Frankie. What are you afraid of, sir? Frankie, these days I'm afraid of losing everything I have ever cared about. He looked from Frankie to Mike. And I'm afraid of losing the things I'm beginning to care about. Like us? Asked Frankie. Mr. Howard smiled, but looked sad too. Mike felt a pang in his heart. You see, I had hoped that one day Eunie and I might. Mr. Howard frowned. Get married? Asked Frankie. Mr. Howard blushed. Even his freckles looked brighter. You love her? Asked Frankie. He flung out his hands. It might not matter anymore. I have an opportunity with my firm to transfer to San Francisco at the end of the year. I haven't told them yes or no yet. Frankie took his hand. Please don't go. I can't promise to stay, he said. It depends on what happens here. Mike puzzled. What needed to happen for Mr. Howard to stay? As they approached the park, Frankie ran ahead and joined some boys playing ball. Mike and Mr. Howard sat on a bench. What would become of them if Mr. Howard left? There'd be no more Saturday outings, no more playing ball in the lawn, no more checkers after dinner. Without him around, the house would seem bigger, their lives emptier, especially since Mrs. Sturbridge barely spoke to them. Mike took a deep breath, the big question burning in his stomach. He forced himself to ask it. Mr. Howard, how come Mrs. Sturbridge adopted us? We've hardly seen her since we got here. Even though we look presentable now, she doesn't seem to want us. Mr. Howard took off his hat and stared as if it held all the answers. I guess it must feel that way. I suppose you're old enough to understand and have a right to know. You see, Michael, you and Frankie are her father's final wish. You mean when he was dying? Mr. Howard leaned back. Not exactly. You see, when Eunie was 20, she married a violinist she met in New York at a symphony benefit. He performed abroad for months at a time, so she lived in the big house with her father. Her husband came and went. A few years later, they had a son, Henry. That house became a different place, with him toddling and then running around, so full of life and laughter and joy. He became the light of Eunie's and her father's lives, and she and Mr. Dow spoiled him a little too much. In the young gentleman's department, remembered Mike. Where's Henry now? Against her wishes. Eunie's husband took him to a nearby lake one day. Henry was only 3 and couldn't swim. Her husband wasn't watching. He'd met some friends there and had his eyes on other things. And there was an accident. And Henry died. Suddenly everything became clear. Mike whispered, That's why she didn't want to adopt a child, especially a boy. Mr. Howard stared at the park. She never forgave her husband. They stayed together for a few years, but he was rarely home, and soon he was squandering her money. They finally divorced. Then Eunie shut out the world. She hardly ever left the house. She still had her father, though, right? Asked Mike. Yes, for 5 years. He was in a wheelchair by then, polio. Taking care of him gave her some purpose. But as Mr. Dow grew frailer, he worried that Eunie would never have a family. All he wanted was for her to feel joy and love again. Secretly, he changed his will so that she would inherit his wealth only if she started proceedings to adopt a child within 1 year of his death, preferably a child who was musical. Otherwise, everything would go to charity, including the house. Eunie hadn't performed with an orchestra for years, so if she didn't oblige, she would have no income. Was she surprised? Asked Mike. That's putting it mildly. Angry, surprised, indignant, and sad that her father had died on top of it. At first, she said she wouldn't dishonor Henry's life by replacing him with another child. She tried to get the will changed, but her father was clever. It was almost ironclad. She put off adopting until the year deadline was only weeks away. That's when she sent me to choose a child for her, so she'd be within the law. To buy her more time, Mr. Howard looked at Mike apologetic. I thought our adoption was final. The papers have been filed, but they don't become legal until 3 months have passed. You were adopted the second week of June. The second week of September, it will be said and done. Mike's stomach began to churn. So that's what she meant. I'm trying to undo what's been done. That's why they had hardly seen her. She didn't want to spend any time with them. She was trying to get rid of them. Mike, are you all right? Mike said slowly. So, we were brought here so the lawyers could have an extra 3 months to figure out how she can unadopt us. Mr. Howard nervously rotated his hat around. I'm sorry. He put an arm around Mike's shoulder. Mark pulled away, choking out his words. How soon is she going to send us back? Just tell me, Mr. Howard. I have to know. Legally, she's only required to adopt one child. I suppose she could send you both back and start proceedings on another child. As long as the adoption process is underway, she meets the criteria. But that's not likely to happen. Mike felt as if he'd been scrambling up a cliff. But just as he reached the top, he slipped and fell to the bottom. So she could just keep adopting a different boy every 3 months until the waiting period is up, and make him think he is going to live in a beautiful house and have good things to eat and get nice clothes and spend time with you. And then, when he gets his hopes up that something right is finally happening in his life, she'll just send him back to Bishop's. Mike, I don't think it'll ever come to that. Mike's mind raced, and his words tumbled. I gotta look out for Frankie. Bishop's won't be taking any lowers come September, and he can't go back to the state home. Kids die there. Mike clenched his fist. Why did you choose us if you knew? Maybe another family would have come along. Maybe a family who cared about us would have... He choked back a lump in his throat. Mike, listen to me. When I met you and Frankie, I knew immediately there was something special about you boys. I lost my own brother in the war, and I'd give anything to have him back. I couldn't separate you. That day at Bishop's, it became apparent that Mrs. Pennyweather intended to do what she intended to do. I figured if I brought you here, you and Frankie would be safely together for at least the summer, and hopefully longer. Mike dropped his head. I knew it was too good to be true. Mr. Howard said quietly, it will all be good and true in the end. I'm hanging my hat on it. He blew out a long breath. You know, Mike, she wasn't always closed off and distant. Grief did that to her. She was such a loving mother, and when she was with Henry, her happiness just spilled over. She can be, quite wonderful and so talented. She was a concert pianist, you know. When she walked out on stage, my heart and the whole world stood still. I admit that bringing you and Frankie here was a risk, but I still think it was the right thing. Can't we hope for the best? How could Mike hope for the best when the worst seemed more probable? He didn't answer. Mr. Howard sighed and patted Mike on the back. I would adopt you myself if the law allowed a single man to do such a thing, but it doesn't. He stood and walked to a vendor with a push cart and came back with 3 good humor bars. He called Frankie and waved him over. Frankie climbed on a bench and grinned, his cheeks pink from playing. Thank you, Mr. Howard. He licked the dribbles from his ice cream bar, and quickly as they melted. He looked up at Mike. You're not eating. What's wrong? Nothing, kid. Mike wasn't going to fill Frankie's mind with the prospect of the state home. Besides, that was his job to worry. Frankie finished and begged Mr. Howard to push him on the swing. Mike stayed on the bench, staring at the good humor bar, watching the chocolate slide from the vanilla center. He held it over the grass as it fell apart, first the shell and then the insides. Chapter 16. That night Mike couldn't sleep. The hours and his problems seemed never ending. His mind was a fog. He watched patches of light crawl across the ceiling as the moon tried to peek through the branches of the elm in the side yard. He slid from the bed and paced, clenching and unclenching his hands, feeling as helpless as he had at Bishop's. He looked at Frankie, safe and fed and sound asleep, his mouth curled in a smile. Mike picked up the harmonica and leaned on the windowsill looking out. The North Star gleamed. Softly he began a slow and simple rendition of Home Sweet Home. How he missed Granny. He wished he could be little again. Leaning against her on the piano bench while she gave lessons. What should he do now? She had said the right person would find them, but who? And where was the path he should take? The second time through the song, he broke up the tune, like Mr. Potter had taught him, sprinkling in the trials and tribulations of his heart. Mr. Potter's words played in his mind. It's about what folks want but don't have. No matter how much you don't have, there's always so much more of life to be had. There's equal amount of maybe things will get better someday soon. His clouded thoughts began to thin. Frankie wanted a family. Mrs. Sturbridge needed to fulfill her father's final wish. One child would do that. One child was what she'd been expecting. Would she be more inclined to keep Frankie if Mike were out of the picture? He filled up on the music and on the idea. He lowered the harmonica and turned it over in his hands. The moonlight caught it and glowed. He traced a finger over the M. He closed his eyes. Where could he go? If he went back to Bishop's and was put out to hire or ran away, Frankie would be devastated. But if Mike did something else, like audition and join the harmonica band, the kid would be thrilled for him. He slipped away from the windowsill and took his metal box from a drawer in the dresser. He pulled out the newspaper article from the Inquirer and ran his finger across the headline, Hoxie's Harmonica Wizards. Mike's eyes scanned the page, searching for the paragraph he needed. The band has the support and philanthropy of their own women's auxiliary. In cases where children are itinerant and in need, Mr. Hoxie and the Women's Auxiliary have taken in exceptional players and placed them with patron families so they can experience the dynamic benefits of the band and its musical camaraderie while living in a home environment. If Mike made the band, he wouldn't need to tell Frankie that he was planning to live with another family until later. By then, it would be September in time for school to start. He'd make sure Frankie saw this as a big opportunity for Mike. He'd pretend it was what he'd always wanted. He'd promise to come home between tours. He'd tell his brother anything to keep him safe. Convincing Frankie would be the easy part. The rest would only work if he was chosen by Hoxie, and if she could open her heart again. What had Mouse said? Everybody has a heart. Sometimes you gotta work hard to find it. If there's something you want or need to know from grown folks, you gotta step up and ask for it mannerly. Plead your case. Mike went back to bed, put a protective arm around Frankie, and fell asleep with a familiar burden, wondering about all the things that could go wrong. And that is where we'll stop.